Welcome everyone to the Verifi Visa Claims Resolution webinar. We're going to talk this morning about Visa's VCR initiative. But to start off with, we just want to remind everybody that we are muting all the lines, and then at the end of the presentation, we will accept questions through the Q&A. And this morning, presenting on this content is myself, Mary Barbaro. I'm the Director of Chargeback Products and Reporting here at Verifi. And along with me is Doug Bertram. He's the Senior Director of Business Development. So our agenda this morning is three main topics. First, we'll start off with explaining what is Visa Claims Resolution. Then we'll get into some decision points, meaning what does this mean to you? And then minimizing impacts of VCR. So the first question, what is Visa Claims Resolution? Most people have heard of Visa Claims Resolution, abbreviated as VCR, and it is a widespread impacting new rules process that Visa is introducing, and it will be effective all around the globe in every country where Visa has acceptance, and it is already live as of October 2017 in New Zealand and Hong Kong. It will be live in the US and the rest of the world on April 14th, 2018. And this new process affects the dispute process for everyone in the payments ecosystem. That includes cardholders represented by issuers and merchants represented by acquirers, and then, of course, other third-party entities that are involved in the payments ecosystem like Verifi. So the next thing I want to talk about Visa Claims Resolution is this whole concept that they're moving from a litigation-based dispute process to a liability assignment model. I'll get into that in more detail, but it'll help first if we go through some of their goals and objectives. So the first thing that Visa is attempting to do is to automate and prevent. What that means is that they're trying to use information in their system to automate the decisioning process to determine whether or not a dispute should actually even enter the system at all. So they'll use information that's been entered into the system, whether it's at the authorization phase, the settlement of the sale, issuance of a refund. They'll use all this information and they'll determine whether or not a dispute should be rejected back to the issuer. And if they do that, they're hoping that they're going to reduce the total number of disputes entering the system by about 14%. The next thing they're doing is trying to streamline the workflows. So they're introducing two new workflows, one named Allocation and the other Collaboration. They expect that 60 to 80% of all the claims will be resolved via Allocation. So we're going to spend a lot more time talking about that. And then lastly, they're trying to simplify. They're doing this in a couple of different ways. Through the workflow changes, they're going to be reducing the total time frames that are allowed for the whole dispute process to go end to end. They're also taking the 22 dispute codes, or what they refer to today as reason codes, and they're consolidating them into 4 categories: fraud, authorization, processing errors, and consumer disputes. So those 4 categories are going to help define which workflow those particular dispute codes will enter. So we'll start off here talking about terminology and then get into more of the specifics of the workflows and other changes. So first of all, terminology changes. The term chargeback is going to be replaced with the term dispute. They're also replacing the term representment with the term dispute response. Condition code replaces reason code, And then I also already mentioned the 2 new workflows that they're adding, allocation and collaboration. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that there are these 4 new condition codes starting off with 10, 11, 12, and 13. The .x refers to a digit which will indicate the reference to whatever particular code that is, and it allows us to make a reference back to the legacy code. And I'll show more about that on the next slide. So each of these different condition codes, all fraud will start with 10, all authorization will be starting with 11, processing errors will start with 12, and consumer disputes will start with 13. They're also removing the do not recognize reason code 75 altogether. And we'll delve into that a bit more as to what that really means to issuers and merchants. Merchants will continue to be able to respond to disputes when providing proof of purchase or other compelling evidence, and we'll talk more about that as well. So on this chart that you see here, there are all of the different categories that I mentioned, and each of those categories has the condition codes. 10.1, for example, replacing reason code 62. And all of the codes have a reference to the legacy code, and there are some where the digits go out further, so like 12.6.1 and 12.6.2 actually split reason codes. So we'll include this chart as a reference in an FAQ, and we'll be communicating that out to you as well. But in this chart, you can see that there is a relationship between the categories of fraud, authorization, or processing errors in consumer disputes, in that they roll up to the particular workflow that they will follow. So all fraud, 10.x, and all authorization, 11.x, will follow the allocation workflow. The 12.x and 13.x processing errors and consumer disputes will follow the collaboration workflow. So before we get into what are those things, allocation and collaboration, I'm going to go back to what today's process is. This is more to give a reference and ability to compare. So today, Visa process follows what they refer to as a litigation model. Litigation is really the process that our U.S. justice system is based on, where you have a plaintiff and a defendant, and they bring the case to a court, and that goes back and forth with their evidence, for example. And in the case of Visa, with the current chargeback process, it mirrors that litigation process that happens within our court systems. Although Visa is the ruling body here, it's really self-governance. So if we start with the process in step 1, the consumer initiates the dispute. They then submit that through their issuer. They contact their issuer indicating whatever the problem is, and then the issuer enters that into the system and passes it through to the acquirer. They either can submit initially a retrieval request, or they can initiate a chargeback. At that point, the issuer is making all the decisions about what reason code to associate this particular dispute with, and there's no filter at that stage other than the issuer's interpretation of the Visa rules. So all the claims enter the system. They then are passed from the acquirer over to the merchant. And in our case, Verifi is represented there in the case where we represent merchants using our dispute recovery managed services. So the litigation model represented here is really this back and forth process. I sometimes refer to it as a ping pong game, but it really takes a fairly lengthy amount of time, and depending on reason code, can often go up to about 180 days in length. Now, I'll get into now some of the new processes. Now, starting off with allocation. So the new rule system assigns liability, and this is Visa assigning the liability in the allocation flow. the way they're trying to accomplish this is they're going to use information that they have in their system. They're going to introduce edit checks. They're going to automate the process of interrogating the dispute coming from the issuer and determining its validity. Once they look at the information, let's say it's an authorization-related claim, they will determine, what the timing was of the authorization, and if the authorization was too old, for example, then they may apply a particular condition code. But if the dispute itself is completely beyond time frames, then they may reject it entirely. So this is the stage at which they are intending to reduce the total disputes by 14%. So if they do agree that the dispute coming from the issuer is valid, they will submit it into the system, the acquirer will receive that dispute, and then they have 30 days to respond. So the acquirer here, of course, is representing the merchant. In that case, the Visa system is considering that to be a final disposition, meaning they have assigned liability to the merchant/acquirer at this stage. The only recourse at this point to an allocation flow dispute is pre-arbitration. So at this stage, the option is go out the door with pre-arbitration, and at Verifi, we're going to refer to that as an outgoing pre-arbitration. So if on behalf of a merchant, we submit an outgoing pre-arbitration, the issuer then has 30 days to respond. Now, the way the funds flow here is that at the point where the dispute is considered valid by Visa and it ends up in the hands of the acquirer, then funds are moving. And usually that is where the merchant is debited. It is dependent on the acquirer because some acquirers will float the chargeback or the dispute until the final disposition, but most, of course, are going to debit the merchant at that stage. But I'm noting this because at the outgoing pre-arbitration, there is no movement of money. The only movement of funds happens again at the point where the issuer is responding to the pre-arbitration, and the response can either be an acceptance or a denial. If it is a pre-arbitration acceptance from the issuer, then at Verifi, we're referring to that as a pre-arbitration 1. If it is a denial, then we are going to refer to that as a pre-arbitration lost. And that is where the money moves, at the response from the issuer. So at that point, it can either be left as is, or the acquirer on behalf of the merchant can escalate it to arbitration. They have 10 days to do that, and then a final ruling would be made by Visa, and the information would flow back to the issuer and acquirer as to the resolution. So that's allocation. That is the newest flow that is being introduced and the most different from what we see today. Now, collaboration, which is on the right side of the screen, is very similar to the back and forth litigation process that we know of today, but the intent here is that Visa is trying to encourage back and forth communication between the parties in the payments ecosystem. So the issuer representing the cardholder and the acquirer representing the merchant. And they're encouraging use of this concept of a questionnaire where each of those parties will enter information into the system as part of the dispute process to help inform the other. And they're also encouraging, through a different process, the communication of that information electronically or through their Visa Resolve online portal. So in collaboration, the primary difference between today is the time frames. So today, it's 45 days in each case for the dispute response or the pre-arbitration. In the new model starting April 14th, the dispute will be initiated by the issuer. The acquirer will receive that on behalf of the merchant, and then the response has to be done within 30 days. The same thing with the issuer response to the pre-arbitration, that has to be done within 30 days. And in this case, we are referring to the pre-arbitration as incoming, meaning incoming to the merchant from the issuer. Now, the other thing to note about the timeframes here is that Visa is eventually planning to reduce the total timeframes on each of these response cycles to 20 days. They were originally saying that that would happen a year after the initial introduction of VCR. So we're not sure whether that means it's going to happen in April of 2019 or October of 2019 or 2018 for that matter. But what we do know is that they already have been implementing fees that will encourage the response to happen within 20 days. If it happens beyond 20 days, then fees will be incurred. So at Verifi, one of the things we're trying to do to reduce exposure to our merchants who use our dispute recovery services is we're going to shoot for an SLA of 15 days so that we at least give the acquirer 5 days to make that 20-day deadline. So the Visa here is trying to incent merchants to respond within that 20-day time frame. So our assumption is that that 20 days is going to be reduced fairly quickly after VCR goes live. Now, the other thing to note here is that there is expected to be a response, not only either a pre-arbitration or dispute response, but if the merchant decides that they want to take liability or that they have to take liability, there is expected an explicit acceptance of the dispute. So that's something fairly new in that there are fees, again, being implemented to incent merchants and Verify on behalf of merchants to do an explicit acceptance of the dispute or the incoming pre-arbitration. So we're going to be doing that on behalf of our merchants to help reduce fees. Merchants still have the option of letting it expire, but fees would be incurred depending on the acquirer. In some cases, we're hearing that acquirers are going to automatically accept on behalf of their merchants and they won't pass on the fees. In other cases, they are not doing that and they will be passing on the fees. So it really depends on the acquirer, and as a merchant, you should check with your acquirer to understand how they're implementing the fees, because they are all doing it differently from what we understand. So the rest of the flow on collaboration is very similar to allocation in that the pre-arbitration response comes back, and if either party, well in this case the issuer, wants to proceed to arbitration, they can do that, and then Visa makes a decision. So the last thing on this workflow piece that I wanted to talk through is just a little bit deeper dive into what Visa is doing to make these decisions up front and assign the liability. So they're introducing these global edit checks. They're looking at the rules and comparing that rule to the data they have in the system that they may have collected through the payments process or through the questionnaires. And then they're going to make that decision up front, which is what's reducing those incoming disputes in that range of 15% or 14% that they have quoted. So this is just a little bit more detail about how they're intending to do that, to block invalid disputes from entering the system altogether. And that represents a pretty significant dollar amount in terms of the disputes entering the system. But there are more complexities to it, and we're going to get into that a little bit more here. So in this part of the presentation, we're going to transition over to talking a little bit about the impacts and some decision points that merchants and issuers also have. And in this case, we're kind of trying to answer the question, so what? You know, what does VCR really mean to me, and what do I have to do about it? So the first decision point that we see in the process is something merchants should think about. Now, of course, Visa is going to be interrogating the data. They're going to determine whether or not the liability should be assigned to the issuer. But merchants can be protected by using things like 3D Secure, because in 3D Secure, if a merchant is using it, then they're protected from liability against fraud. And since Visa is quoting that 60 to 80% of the disputes that will result after VCR is live would be in the allocation flow, that means that they're anticipating that the total volume of fraud disputes is going to increase. So merchants can protect themselves from that by participating in 3D Secure Verified by Visa. Now, over the years, there have been some, skepticism about participating, various reasons like shopping cart abandonment and things like that. But it is still a point where merchants really should look at the concept and consider whether after VCR it really makes more sense if they're not participating. The next thing that we think is going to be pretty relevant, especially on the issuer side of the flow, is that today issuers receive calls from their consumer or cardholder that are questioning a transaction. And at that point, oftentimes the issuer will result in choosing the reason code 75 does not recognize, because that's what their consumer may be telling them. But this is really going to result in the issuer having to really decide whether to then take this transaction that they might have submitted with a chargeback reason code of 75 and whether they want to actually report it as true fraud. Because oftentimes if the consumer is saying they don't recognize it, it is really not true fraud, as in a third party is really trying to defraud the system. It is more likely that the issue is friendly fraud, where somebody in that cardholder circle actually did conduct the transaction, or they just don't recognize the merchant descriptor. So if those friendly fraud transactions end up entering the system as then true fraud, meaning they start with a reason code 10.x, then it's going to dilute the total fraud picture, if you will. And part of that is going to be based on the fact that the issuer is going to have to decide if they do enter it as true fraud, will they also put it on the fraud file, which means that they're entering it into this TC40 file. Issuers have to make this decision, and if they do decide that they're going to add it to the fraud file, then it's going to be completely diluting the TC40 file with friendly fraud, where today the TC40 file is used for data compromise, for possible reimbursement to the issuer. And so if there are benefits to the issuer to entering this information onto the TC40 file, but in the future, if the friendly fraud transactions end up diluting this file, then it's going to be less useful. And that's also for merchants, because merchants today often will use the TC40 file to identify potential fraud. If this file is then diluted with the friendly fraud, then it becomes a difficult choice as to whether or not to use this file for consideration of things like it initiating a refund. Because if the transaction was really friendly fraud, then the merchant ends up double refunding if they're using the TC40 file to determine whether or not they should credit the cardholder. So the next thing that we want to talk about is a decision point which is really affecting merchants. So Visa's intention is to reduce the total time frames in the dispute process. Today's process goes out anywhere between 75 to 180 days in some cases, depending on the reason code. In the future, their goal is to reduce down to either the 70-day range with allocation or 100-day range with a collaboration workflow. And then if they reduce down to the 20-day time frame, which we were talking about earlier, it even gets smaller. So here becomes a challenge for merchants. I mean, at this point, trying to gather all the compelling evidence within a 20-day time frame or even a 30-day time frame is going to be quite challenging. So it is something that merchants are going to have to try to determine, are they going to increase staffing? Are they going to consider outsourcing the dispute response? And there's a lot of considerations in that process to try to get down to this 30 or 20-day time frame. And then lastly, the question of what compelling evidence to provide. We've categorized the compelling evidence options into 4 different areas: proof of delivery, customer communication, social media, and customer information. And clearly, these particular categories of compelling evidence will depend on the condition code that is being presented. So things like customer communication and social media can be helpful in showing a previous relationship and pattern with that consumer, which then really does provide an argument against a fraud reason code. And so if friendly fraud is being reported in that category, this kind of information, this compelling evidence, can be a good response to that. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to my colleague, Doug Bertram.
Thanks, Mary. So appreciate everybody joining the webinar today. And what I wanted to do is take a look at how these changes by Visa are going to impact merchants. So as Mary discussed, the new process does have some benefits for merchants. In fact, kicking out 14 to 15% of invalid disputes immediately is going to reduce the number of chargebacks, both from a chargeback ratio standpoint, but also from a what cases have to be worked by teams within the merchant. So that's a great benefit. But what comes along with that benefit is the fact that 60 to 80%, as Visa claims, are going to be pushed into that allocation bucket, which will eliminate some of the current chargeback representment rights that a merchant has. So how do we actually go in and look at preventing disputes from ever entering the system in the first place? And what we're recommending at Verifi is really getting in front of the dispute so that it minimizes actually what is put into the VCR process. By getting in front of the dispute, you're able to address friendly fraud that we talked quite a bit about at the beginning of this presentation, that with the new changes and the new classifications, the reason codes that a lot of friendly fraud was buried in might end up coming through as true fraud and being allocated to the bucket that doesn't allow a merchant to fight unless they're going to go to the pre-arb and all the costs that are associated. So those are all things that you need to consider as a merchant and really figure out, how do we get out in front of these disputes? What we know from the data that we were able to research and get completed is that most consumers would rather call their issuing bank to dispute a transaction than to call the merchant. And that ranges anywhere from 76% to 26%, depending upon the old existing reason codes. And that might be because the merchant feels like, the consumer feels like, if I call my issuing bank, they're not going to have any questions for me. They're just going to take care of it. But if I call the merchant, I might not get the result that I want. And I might have to, listen to an upsell, cross-sell presentation. So the majority of calls are going to go to the issuing banks when a consumer has a problem with a transaction. But we also know, based on additional research, that when a consumer does call the merchant, 56% of the time, there is a real favorable response to the call. The merchant is able to, without having to refund or replace, the product, they are able to solve that problem. 28% of the time, they're able to solve it with a replacement product. Only 16% of the calls that come into the merchant actually then end up going on to a disputed transaction at the issuing bank level. And in this whole process, and all these changes that are happening, there's not really a big impact at the friendly fraud side. Actually, retiring the do not recognize reason codes is likely to increase the rate of friendly fraud. And one of the key drivers, and every merchant that I talk to really demonstrates this, which is issuing banks only account for they think that only about 17% of the disputes that they get are actually friendly fraud, where merchants who have more data can really dig into and figure out what's going on, see double that. So 34% of the disputes that they see, they consider friendly fraud. So there's a big disconnect between the issuer and the merchant, and getting out in front of these disputes allows the merchant to really direct what is happening with those disputes. So as a merchant, what can you do? Well, so there's a couple things that merchants can do immediately, and this is a takeaway that you could go to your acquiring bank today to discuss, which is having clear merchant descriptors. One of the largest areas of issue when a consumer calls an issuing bank is, I don't recognize this transaction. And that's because you're given a limited character set as a merchant to try to describe what it is that you're selling, and you don't have the ability to really, with those old static descriptors, to really give a good picture of the transaction. So if you can get a clearer description, if you are able to use dynamic or soft descriptors where you're able to put in additional information into the descriptor that helps identify what that transaction was for, you're able to get out in front of those calls that are coming into the issuing banks today where the consumer doesn't recognize the transaction. Also, providing the clear merchant contact information, whether that's a good 800 number on the actual descriptor that's going to show up on the consumer's statement, or whether that's including contact information across your websites, across any inserts that you may put into products that are shipped, across any accesses or emails that you send out to the consumers. Make sure they have a clear and easy way to contact you, just so that you're making sure that any consumer who is interested in reaching out to you has a good way to get a hold of you. But then there are also a couple other ways to really get in front of a dispute, and that's by providing product information, shipping usage details, return policies with your terms and conditions, as well as transactional information that would be maybe IP address, ABS CVV, device IP, geolocation, all of that, to be able to actually provide that dispute response level detail to the issuers before they actually make a decision on how to process a consumer dispute. And so what we've done at Verifi is we've created a solution called Order Insight, which is really end-to-end dispute resolution. So what we do is we work with merchants to take that compelling evidence information, that dispute resolution information, and provide it to the issuing banks so that when they are on the phone with the customers, they can help solve that customer question. If there's a question about what is this transaction, I don't recognize it, by having all of the information available to them, the issuer is actually able to work on behalf of the merchant almost as a customer service rep to be able to provide that compelling evidence and to provide the details of the transaction to help jog the consumer's memory. So we also have developed a solution called Cardholder Dispute Resolution Network, where, again, we are short-circuiting this process of whether it be the new Visa or MasterCard, any of these processes where we are actually able to inform a merchant about a consumer that is disputing a charge. So with a cardholder dispute resolution network, when a consumer calls their issuing bank and the issuing bank notices that that particular transaction is eligible to be worked through the CDR network, what they do is they stop their normal chargeback process. They stop any notifications to Visa or MasterCard, and they notify the merchant through Verifi's web-based portal that says this consumer is disputing this transaction. And that, again, allows the merchant to get ahead of a particular instance of a dispute. In where most of my merchants have a 100% money-back guarantee in certain groups, they just want to make sure that the customer is taken care of. They have a low cost of goods sold. They actually are just asking and raising their hands and saying, issuers, if we knew that this consumer had a problem, we would gladly refund them their money. So what our Cardholder Dispute Resolution Network does is it allows the issuers a collaborative way to tell the merchant that this consumer is disputing a transaction, and it allows the merchant to take action to refund and to solve the problem for both the merchant, the issuer, and the consumer. We also have a chargeback representment, which, while the process is changing, what's actually happening is there's still the ability to fight against those unwarranted chargebacks that you see. And Verifi has a solution that works to protect the revenue of businesses, to recover those losses, to lower the entire cost of handling these disputes. Well, some merchants, when they come to us, they just feel like, you know, these losses are part of doing business online or part of doing business in an omni-channel environment. We're able to show them actually how having these relationships with the acquirers and the dispute sources and having a subject matter expert like Verifi work on behalf of the merchant, we're able to win back that lost revenue, increase profits, and allow the business to grow with this, you know, additional revenue that they currently were just losing. So how does the process look? Just like Mary prior was showing how that process flows, we're going to take a look starting in the top left of this diagram, and we're going to take a look at how a transaction would flow through the system, or how a dispute would flow through this system. So let's just say that there's a call center inquiry. A consumer calls the issuing bank. That's the first icon. The issuing bank customer service rep is going to look and see, is there additional information that's provided by Verifi? And they do that by looking up a certain number of the transactional data points, and if those transactional data points match what is in the order insight system, within the customer service rep's order screen, you know, the screen that they're going to use to help the consumer, all of the transactional information, all the delivery information, any of the other compelling evidence pieces are going to show up so that they can actually use that information to solve the question or solve the concern that the consumer had. That leads to a happy customer, both merchant, consumer, and the issuing bank. Let's just say in that transaction that there wasn't any information available through Order Insight because the merchant wasn't participating in the network. Then the flow would go to, well, is this merchant participating in the Cardholder Dispute Resolution Network? If they are, then what's going to happen is you're going to see the yes down into the bottom right CDRN. The issuer is going to initiate the case with the merchant saying this consumer has disputed this transaction. When the consumer or when the merchant does the research, takes a look at the transaction, they decide that this is a valid dispute, they refund. Again, you have a happy issuer, happy merchant, and happy consumer. The benefits to both of these scenarios is that those disputes never enter the Visa or MasterCard systems. So they're handled even before the new VCR changes take place. So this is great because it allows that merchant to get ahead of this new VCR process and to properly guide the issuers into determining that this is a valid transaction, so that it doesn't have to go into the Visa system and have Visa apply those new automated rules to determine whether or not this was a valid dispute, or whether it's in that new allocation category that is going to push that into the streamlined workflow and not give the merchant the ability to fight and win back that transaction revenue. But if the dispute that comes through doesn't have any order insight information available, isn't eligible for CDRN, that's when the VCR process would kick into place, and that's where Verifi can still help its merchant base by actually fighting and representing, or in this case, disputing, doing the dispute management process for the merchant as the subject matter expert in both the new VCR as well as MasterCard and the programs that it's coming up with, American Express, Discover, PayPal, any of those other potential dispute sources. I know we're running up against a time block here, so I want to just quickly go through. There's multiple implementation options. It depends on which solution that you're looking to deploy for these types, all the way from web-based portals to Verifi doing the integration through a fast-track integration to direct API or batch data communications between the two groups. So we have made the process and the implementation as easy as possible for the merchants, and have given as many options as possible for the merchants to allow them to get in and to leverage the solutions that are going to help the merchant get out in front of the disputes, and then for those that aren't able to be worked that way, to be able to fight and win back more revenue for them through the representment process. The Verifi One solution is our total chargeback management solution, and it allows and helps merchants to deflect up to 55% of disputes before they even enter into the Visa or MasterCard systems. So we're preventing true fraud, identifying friendly fraud, saving the sale, managing disputes. You can read the bullet points, but essentially what this does, this is the results that we see when merchants leverage order insight and CDRN before the normal dispute process even takes place. We're able to help a majority of the cases be affected before they actually become disputes and enter the system. So this is a win for everybody. You've got order insights where we're able to share your information, transactional information. We're able to share shipping and usage and all the other customer service components that go with that. We're able to share that with the issuers at time of a dispute so that they can work on your behalf to save those sales and to stop the disputes from becoming chargebacks. CDRN is involved in this scenario where we're able to notify merchants when a consumer disputes a transaction before the issuing bank finalizes their chargeback process, and we're able to offer chargeback representment services to recover those lost profits by doing it as an outsourced solution so that you can keep your internal people focused on what's going to make the most money and going to give you the best growth for your organization. So that ends our quick presentation on VCR and how not only Verifi is working with Visa on these transactions or on these new changes to understand them, to continue being our merchant subject matter expertise on everything that's happening in this marketplace, but also on the solutions that we have available for merchants to allow them to get into a situation that puts their information in front of the issuers and in front of these new processes that Visa are rolling out.